You know the moment. The package is on your doorstep. And the strange truth is, this, right now, is the best it's going to feel. 3 days later, that thing you had to have is just furniture. And your thumb is already scrolling toward the next one. It's not just you. It's everyone. It's always been everyone. Why doesn't getting what you want ever turn the wanting off? There's an answer to that question, a precise one, and it's 2,500 years old. It's recorded in the oldest Buddhist texts we have, and it's much smarter than just want less. As always on this channel, real sources, real suttas. I'll show you exactly where everything lives. And the story starts with an insult. Because one of the clearest answers the Buddha ever gave about wanting was to a man who came to tell him off. A man who looked at this whole teaching and called it an attack on life itself. Honestly, he had a point worth hearing. The Majjhima Nikaya, the collection of the Buddha's middle-length talks, records the scene in Sutta 75, a town called Kamasadama in the Kuru country of northern India. A wandering philosopher named Magandiya arrives, sees the grass mat where the Buddha has been sleeping, and says to his host, the Brahmin Bharadwaja, that this Gautama is a destroyer of growth. A destroyer of growth, anti-progress, anti-flourishing, anti-life. If that accusation sounds familiar, it should. It's the exact same charge people level at Buddhism today. Doesn't wanting things drive everything good? Ambition, art, falling in love, getting off the couch? Kill desire and what's left? A life of beige oatmeal? So Magandiya walks in ready for a fight, and the Buddha does something disarming. He doesn't argue back. He tells the man about his own past. Before the robes, he says himself, he had 3 mansions, one for the cold season, one for the hot, one for the rains. The prince in a gilded cage story, you know, comes from later biography. During the 4 months of the rains, he says, he never once came down from the upper palace. Musicians played for him up there. In other words, whatever pleasure you're imagining, he'd had it, on tap, for years. This isn't a man who fears the buffet. He grew up living on it. And here's the part he only saw afterwards. In his own telling, the understanding came later. The feast kept arriving, and the hunger kept arriving with it. Later, he'd put it precisely. He knew the sweetness of pleasures, he knew their drawbacks, and he knew the escape. That's why, he tells Magandiya, he doesn't envy anyone's palace. Not because he's above it, because he'd been to the top of it. And looking back, he says, the top was still hungry. Magandiya isn't convinced. Of course he isn't. You probably aren't either. Giving up palaces because they don't land? That still sounds like giving up. So the Buddha reaches for an image. And it's one of the most uncomfortable, unforgettable images in the entire Pali Canon. We'll get there. But his full answer, the one that ends with Magandiya asking to be ordained, doesn't make sense yet. First, you need to hear the very first thing the Buddha ever taught anyone. Rewind to the very beginning. A deer park outside Varanasi called Isipatana. 5 ascetics, his first audience ever. This is the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, setting the wheel of the teaching in motion, the first sermon, and it opens with a correction to both extremes. He'd lived the extreme of indulgence, then the opposite, austerity pushed to the edge of starving. Both, he tells them, are dead ends. there's a middle way. Then comes the frame later teachers would call a physician's. Here's the symptom, here's the cause, here's the cure, here's the treatment. The discourse gives the four truths. The medical reading came after. The symptom? Dukkha. Life as we normally live it carries a low hum of not quite right. Stress, friction, that ache of this isn't it. And the cause, the second noble truth, gets a name. Tanha. And here's where translation matters more than almost anywhere else in Buddhism. Tanha doesn't mean desire in general. It literally means thirst. Not wanting a glass of water. The parched, cracked lips feeling of needing one. The sutta's definition is exact. The craving that makes for further becoming, accompanied by passion and delight, relishing now here and now there. Relishing now here, now there. Sit with that phrase. It's a description of a thing that never stays put. The moment it gets what it aimed at, it re-aims. The first sermon splits this thirst three ways. Craving for sense pleasure. The doorstep package, the next bite, the next episode. Craving for becoming. Thirst for the next version of you. The promotion, the follower count, the person you'll finally be after the next milestone. And craving for non-becoming? In the texts, the thirst not to exist at all, bound up with the view that death simply ends you. The 1 a.m. urge to switch yourself off is our echo of it, not its definition. Notice what's not on the list. The objects. The Buddha never says the package is evil, or the promotion, or the pleasure. The problem was never the water. The problem is the thirst that rearms itself the instant you drink. Which brings us back to Magandiya, because that's exactly what the Buddha was about to show him. Back in Kamasadhamma, Magandiya has heard the palace story, and the Buddha asks him to picture a man with leprosy. His whole body is wounds, and the wounds itch, the kind of deep itch that owns your entire mind. So he scratches them open, and then he finds the fire. He stands over a pit of burning coals and cauterizes his flesh, leans his ruined skin toward the heat. And here is the terrible thing. It feels wonderful. Real relief. That's what makes the image so honest. The scratching, the scorching. The texts don't pretend it feels bad. It feels like exactly what he needs. But every scratch opens the wounds wider. Every session over the coals leaves the disease worse, the itch deeper. The relief and the ruin are the same motion. Now, says the Buddha, imagine a physician actually cures him. New skin, healthy, whole. And one day, he walks past that same fire pit. Does he look at the people crouched over the coals and think, lucky them? He does not. There is nothing there he wants anymore. The sutta pushes it further. If two strong men grabbed the cured man and dragged him toward the coals, he would twist his body every way to get free. Because, and this is the sentence that lands the whole teaching, the fire was painful all along. It didn't change. He changed. Only the disease had made it feel like relief. That's the Buddha's answer to destroyer of growth. He isn't anti-pleasure. He's saying some of what we call pleasure is scratching, and you can't know which while the disease is running. Then the Buddha speaks a verse. Freedom from disease, the foremost fortune. Nibbana, the foremost ease. Magandiya knows it. His own teachers handed it down. See? Even your verse agrees, he says. Health is the highest thing, and I'm healthy. The Buddha's reply, you learned that line the way a blind man learns about white cloth. A man blind from birth is handed a filthy oil-stained rag by a swindler. Here, a fine white cloth. He wears it proudly. He believes it because someone told him. Not because he can see it. And that, the Buddha says, is how most of us hold our ideas about happiness. Secondhand, untested, on faith in the crowd. Is this a harsh teaching? Honestly, yes. It's calling some of what we love a symptom. The Buddha knew how it sounded. The suttas record people pushing back constantly. But notice he never says, believe me instead. The whole framework is an invitation to check, to notice, once, what your mind feels like in the moment a craving lets go. Now, jump 25 centuries to a neuroscience lab, because in the 1990s, researchers found a crack in the human reward system, right where the Buddha said it would be. Psychologists Kent Berridge and Terry Robinson were studying dopamine, the brain chemical everyone calls the pleasure molecule, except their data kept saying it isn't one. In their experiments, suppressing the dopamine system killed a rat's motivation to seek reward, but its pleasure reactions, the liking, stayed intact. Wanting and liking, it turns out, run on separate circuitry. Dopamine drives the chase, the anticipation, not the enjoyment. The itch has its own engine. Which explains a very modern kind of misery. Craving things you don't even enjoy anymore. Anyone who's scrolled a feed at 1 a.m., bored and unable to stop, has felt the two systems split apart. In addiction research, this is the signature pattern. Wanting climbs while liking collapses. More thirst, less water. The leper leaning closer to the coals. The Dhammapada, the Buddha's most famous verse collection, saw the shape of it long before the lab did. Craving, it says, grows like a creeping vine. And there's a second experiment you should know. 1978, psychologists studied people who had won the lottery, the jackpot, the dream, and compared them with ordinary controls. The famous result? The winners were not measurably happier, and they rated everyday pleasures, breakfast, a chat, a laugh, lower than people who'd never won. Psychologists called it the hedonic treadmill. You run, the belt moves, the scenery stays. Later research has added nuance. The effect isn't absolute, but the adaptation is real. The Dhammapada's version is a tree. Cut it down, and if the root is intact, it just grows back. Suffering returns again and again until the root of craving is pulled. Not the branches, not the objects. You can cancel the order, delete the app, quit the job, and watch the same thirst sprout somewhere new by Thursday. Okay, but if craving is the root, doesn't the whole project eat itself? I want to stop wanting. That's a want. One Brahmin marched into a monastery to ask precisely that. The Samyutta Nikaya, Sutta 51.15, a park called Gosita's Monastery near Kosambi. A Brahmin named Unaba comes to see Ananda, the Buddha's attendant and right hand. His question is sharp, and it's genuine. You monks train to abandon desire, yes? But you use desire to get there, the desire, 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 Ananda doesn't argue. He asks one question back. Brahman, before you walked to this park, you had the desire to get here, true?
True. And now that you're standing here, where is it? And the Brahman sees it. Gone. Not suppressed, not defeated, finished. It completed its job and dissolved on its own. That, says Ananda, is how the path works. The desire to practice is a walking desire. It carries you to the destination and retires there. It has a finish line built in. Buddhism has two different words hiding under our one word, desire. Tanha, the bottomless thirst, and chanda, plain wanting, which goes either way depending on what it's aimed at. Aimed at the practice, chanda is a ladder. You climb it, then you step off. Aimed at more of everything, it's a treadmill. Same muscle. What matters is where it points. This is the distinction people miss when they say Buddhism wants you ambition-free on a cushion. The Buddha praised chanda. It's literally the first item in his list of the 4 bases of success. Unaba walked in with a checkmate and walked out a lay follower. His last line in the sutta, this path, it turns out, has an end. So what happened to Magandiya, the man who came to call the Buddha an enemy of life? He listened all the way to the end. And then the man who defended pleasure for a living asked to ordain. Rules required a probation for converts from other sects. He offered to serve 4 years. The texts record that he eventually became an arahant, fully awakened. The loudest defender of the coals became the man who no longer glanced at them. Back to your doorstep. Notice, the Buddha never asks you to stop ordering packages. And the spike before the box opens is a modern finding, not his definition. What he named was the thirst underneath it. It was never selling you the thing. It was never about the box. It was selling you the wanting of the thing. So here's the one question experiment. Next time a craving hits hard, don't fight it. Just ask, do I want the thing? Or do I want the feeling of being about to get it? You're not trying to win. You're just looking at the fire with curious eyes, even for 1 second. The Dhammapada says that when craving is seen through, sorrow rolls off, like water beads off a lotus leaf. Life keeps asking big questions, and it turns out a lot of them were already asked to the Buddha 2,500 years ago. That's what this channel is for. Subscribe if you want more. See you in the next one.